Again, last time we spoke about in the first session, this whole course being kind of inspired personally for me by one of my favorite iconic musicians, George Harrison, the former Beatle. So I'm just going to dive back in, kind of harken back to the first session, just to roll us into this topic today. Again, we're not going to cover the same things, but some of this might sound a little familiar to you, but some of it's reinforcement too. We're tackling a topic here that has many layers, and from an understanding and experience point of view, can have many layers as well. So Harrison said, everything you see and do and touch and smell isn't real. And remember that that's kind of where we were diving into, like, what does that mean? What is that about? Why does that matter to me? And why would I use that as any sort of thing to pay attention to? My life's okay. I have happy times and sad times like everyone. So that's nice for Mr. Harrison, but why should that matter to me? So we'll explore that further as we started to in the first session. I'll continue though, and just walk through again the quote that I went through the first session, because I want to make some more comments. Again, remembering that this topic is very layered. Harrison talks about in his autobiography, also called My, Me, Mine. I'll quote him as follows: having LSD was like someone catapulting me into space. The LSD experience was the biggest experience that I had up to that time. And I had mentioned last time that I would talk a little further about that. So I did want to just say a little bit more about that. The kind of experience that Harrison had, and then it moved him to pursue his own path, which is a really important word when we talk about practicing a way forward, a journey that might take us to some answers to this question that Harrison poses, or the statement he makes about everything not being real. I just want to comment that someone who's taken like a mind-altering drug like LSD or mushrooms, as they're used in some very serious traditions around the world, including here in the United States by Native Americans, there's a real tradition of guided processes to open one's mind to these kind of altered state experiences that open doors, unlock doors to seeing things how they really are. And of course, we're not pursuing those in this class, but I did want to give a little bit of legitimacy to what Harrison shares with us, because I did open the course talking about this as a basis for what we were discussing. And of course, we went on to talk about actual structured, meditative, guided practices that are available to us to explore these same sort of realizations that Harrison found on his own. But later in his life, after those initial experiences, he found a guided path as well. He didn't stay with taking mind-altering drugs as a way to try to move forward. They were like a door opener. So I just wanted to give some credence to that on a certain level, not as a practice, but as certainly something that gives some authenticity to what he actually experienced. And that's important, especially since I used it as a sort of like, fly paper to attract people to maybe come to this course, So Harrison continues and says, suddenly I looked around and everything I could see was relative to my ego. That's my piece of paper. That's my flannel. Give it to me, or I am, end quote. And I just want to further comment and layering on what I said last time, that really what his insight was that he was seeing that his ego, and we'll talk a little bit more about ego in a minute, is essentially clinging. You're going to hear that word a lot in this presentation. Clinging is really the root problem. And we're going to explore like what we cling to in terms of being mistaken. So it's not that we want to not be attached to things, but we want to be attached to things in a a non-mistaken way, in a wisdom-filled way. That's where one can find some answers and solutions experientially, intellectually first, and then experientially, to having better mental states moment by moment, having happiness more often than suffering. And that I'm going to keep digging into that, because as we talk about this topic and these kind of meditations that we started doing last session, we're going to continue here, that can get really fuzzy. Because again, this topic has lots of layers, and it could become sort of abstract. Maybe not for you, but certainly for me, it took me many, many years to sort of iron that out. So I might assume that some of you might have the same challenge. Then Harrison continues and says, quote, "It drove me crackers," meaning it really bothered him. And that's because he did have an experience where he was able to see the mistake of how we mislabel ourselves and phenomena, and how that was really a problem. He saw it clearly, very viscerally. And if you witness something, sometimes maybe like in a dream, even, we witness something really intense, and it seems so real, we can be shaken. We could really be moved. It could move us beyond, like, what normally is moving us through our day-to-day, moment-by-moment process. That's what happened to Harrison here, and put him on his own path as he moved forward. He continued and says, quote, "I hated everything about my ego. It was a flash of everything false and impermanent, which I disliked." So he's making a discriminatory comment there right at the end, saying, which I disliked. He didn't like this about himself, what he saw, because he didn't really want to be experiencing life in an unreal way. Again, we'll explore what that really means more. But for a moment here, I want to focus on his part of his statement that he talks about my ego. He hated everything about his ego. And again, it was because he was witnessing things up to that time in his life in a false way, as far as he was able to experience when he had this LSD experience. So I just want to step back and say, for us, as in this course and the practices we'll be doing, I want to identify the ego. Some people who have experience with this topic in terms of meditation and thinking about the self and I and mine and me, mistakenly think about the ego as being something we have to eradicate, get rid of. That's not so much the case. It's really what the ego experiences and identifies with that we would call sort of a false identification, a mistake. So we're not about eradicating anything here. And so with that said, it's more about what flows in the stream of our consciousness moment by moment that we're trying to alter and adjust and see things more clearly. And those are what these meditation practices we're exploring about, and then these lectures are about in terms of what we're trying to identify as these objects of meditation. So I just want to say that from a psychoanalysis point of view, ego means the part of the mind. I said this last time, but it's important. I want to say it again. The part of the mind that mediates between the conscious and the unconscious, and get this, is responsible for reality testing and a sense of personal identity. That's pretty heavy duty. The ego is really important in psychoanalysis. And so we're going to be kind of working with that part of our mind in these practices of what we're exploring in this course to further refine our understanding of like what that part of our mind really is, how it relates to our ongoing stream of consciousness, how that relates to sense of self, how that relates to sense of I, how that relates to our sense of mind, all these things that Harrison had identified. And specifically, as you know, DNKL sponsoring this teaching. The DNKL is a Buddhist center, specifically Tibetan Buddhist, and a lot of the underpinnings and foundation, as some of you know from the reading list that I shared with all of you. This is based on the well grounded and well-developed, centuries-old practices that come from Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism specifically. So in Buddhism, there is a practice for cutting the ego or self. And really what that means, it's a practice that aids and abets stopping this clinging to mistaken concepts of self and ego. Not cutting the self or ego in a conventional sense. I'm here, I'm talking to you, I'm here, you're there, we're communicating, we're functioning. We live moment by moment in the aspect of each one of us as individuals and collectively as well. So again, we're looking at the concept. You're going to hear that word a lot, the concept of mistaken concept of how we identify the ego, how we work with it. And that's what happens in Buddhist practices when we talk about cutting the ego, because these are words that are used, you'll read them. Some of you might even know about a practice, for example, specifically in Buddhism called Chod, C-H-O-D. And it's pretty, it's pretty graphic and engaging, like cutting up the self. So we won't talk about Chod. That's not what this course is about. So I just wanted to underscore that because, again, using Harrison's quotation from his autobiography, I use that as a jumping off point to move us into this topic. So kind of important to come back and revisit the quote and layer it a little bit. So, and before we go back into the meditation practices that we started last week, where we started talking about the meditation practices of how to look at and analyze on one level. There's lots of levels, by the way, and we're going to explore many of them in the next couple of sessions. We'll get to that a little bit later. But we really need to, before we jump back into those meditations where we're looking at the aggregates, the skandhas, as they're called in Sanskrit, and how we misidentify our sense of self with each one of those components, the 5 aggregates, the 5 skandhas. And last time we covered form, feelings, and perception, and those were the first 3 meditation practices that we did at the end of last session. Before we do that, I have to, and I'm going to do this because it's really important to keep panning out and understand what we're really talking about and why it matters. So part of what I'm going to do for the next 15 minutes is just circle back. Some of you have knowledge of what I'm going to talk about, but some of it has to do with what it essentially has to do with is identifying why. Why are we studying this? Why does it matter? What happens when we study this and do some of the practices connected to it? And what are we addressing? So we start by looking at, and I'm going to share my screen if I can find it here. Sorry, folks, I'm a Luddite on a certain level. So let me just share my screen real quick. You'll see the Zoom session first, but then I'm going to flip to some visuals that I have. So hopefully all of you can see your screen my screen if you're using a computer. We talked about this last time, but I'm showing it to you. The Wheel of Life, which is a course I taught last winter session at DNKL, and it really goes into depth about how we can move from our moment by moment walking through life on a day-to-day basis, where we're going about life in what we would say, you'll hear me use this expression a lot, non-analytical way. We're just moving ahead, moment by moment. experiencing what comes up, reacting to it, dealing with it, making discriminatory judgments every split second. And in the wheel of life, what this wheel is it's a teaching on how to wake up from sort of a non-analytical way of going through life moment by moment and being aware, mindful in very specific ways. The wheel teaching gives you a specific mapping of how reality works and how to and giving you tools on how to work with those specific realities. And I zeroed in this course specifically on talking about how life works from the point of view of the realms in the form of mental afflictions that we manifest every single moment, and being aware of them and where they come from and how to work with them in certain meditative practices. And so this graphic I flipped to just shows you the 6 realms that exist in the wheel of life. And they're identified in a certain way. And again, if you want to check this out a little bit more thoroughly, you can read some of the books I put on the reading list from this course. And some of you took that course previously, so you're aware of it. But for those who might be in this course who hadn't attended that, I just wanted to sort of point this out more specifically. Not this one. More specifically, I just wanted to zero in for a moment at the center of the wheel. What you're looking at here is a graphic at the center of the wheel. And at the center of the wheel, you'll see a pig, a rooster, and a snake. And they represent what are called root mental afflictive states of misapprehension, or traditionally is called ignorance of how things really are, which is represented by the pig, which then spawns the rooster and the snake, which stand for attraction to things by misidentifying them, clinging to them through that ignorance that's represented by the pig, or we have aversion to them. It's a very primal switch. We're going to attract every single second, every moment. We're attracted to something or we're pushing something away. And if you stop and think about it and look at how you go through life, that's pretty much what's going on. That's a meditation in and of itself. And one would then have to just move to doing some deeper, there are some meditative practices where you can go into deeper analysis of this kind of thing. But essentially, that's what's going on. I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a minute. I'll come back to that. And that's important to keep in mind, because in the practices that we're pursuing here in this course, these analyses that we're doing, and then the meditative practice that I shared with you last time, the 3 stages of meditation of studying, reflecting, and then meditating in the 2-step process of analysis, and then in the final step, resting in that awareness. We are focused on these specific meditative practices that could be about a lot of different things, but they're about what the self is. And that's tied right to the pig, if you will, the misapprehension right in the center of that wheel. And because it's one of the 3 root afflictions, it becomes essential to cutting off the way we habitually experience the world, where we're mindlessly. I hate to say mindlessly, but that's not the right word. We, in a non-analytical way, are experience things every moment. And I'm going to talk about something really nuanced, but super duper important in terms of where that comes from and how that is something that you can't just say, okay, I'm going to study something and change the way I do that, and then everything's going to be okay. That is sort of the process, but it isn't that simple, unfortunately. So remember that. and this is really, really something to hold in your mind at the very least, that sort of, kind of level of how I just addressed revisiting things in the wheel of life as it's represented there. And I'll go back to that in a minute when I talk about the next item we're going to talk about. So, as we continue just to talk for a few minutes longer about well, where does this mistaken view come from?
Nobody's here from the class. It's only him. I don't even know these people.
Oh, sorry. Somebody has their mic on. If you have your mic on, turn it off. I can hear you talking.
Ronnie, can you mute?
Oh, Ronnie, that's you. Sorry. Thank you, Ron. So as we'll have a Q&A session, and hopefully some of you will have some questions after I finish my talk. So when we just further talk about where does this mistaken view come from, I just glossed over, but wanted to give you something simple to grab onto, which is what we call in Buddhism the three poisons, those three iconic mental afflictive states that are at the root of all the other mental afflictive states that we have. You can, we'll talk about them in a moment. So, but as we experience those things of being attracted to something mistakenly, or pushing something away mistakenly through misapprehending it, where does that really come from for us as an individual? I'm sitting here in this class, I'm listening to this guy. It's like, okay, that sounds good in theoretically, but how am I attached to that? How does that come about? And although we can't assign a beginning in time when that, for each one of us, that's happened. Some of us adhere to systems of belief that, for example, in Buddhism, there's a phrase when we talk about Buddhist cosmology that says we, as all sentient beings, have been in existence since beginningless time. That's like, well, okay, all right, let's put that on the shelf for a minute. That's one frame of reference. But we can all relate to this. We can lay out a lifetime. And we can, through analysis of what I'm going to just talk about for a few minutes, determine its principal causes, where this mistaken view comes from, and how do we exercise it moment by moment as we move through our daily living. And which is based on this misapprehension that I proposed as we saw in the Wheel of Life. So further to that, we're going to talk a little bit about that. And what we're really going to be talking about here is karma. And karma is a really, really important concept. All of us know what it is to some degree. Some of us have taken detailed courses on karma. Some of us have read seriously about it. Some of us have just thought about it. Some of us know it from pop culture. And I'm going to be succinct. I'm not going to go on and on about it, but this is important in terms of laying down, why would we be doing these meditation practices that we're talking about? So I'm going to quote from a text called Precious Garland by a great Buddhist sage called Nagarjuna. And in that, in this very short quote, he talks about how, based on ignorance, we are moved into action. And then from that produces suffering. And these are what are called the three thorough afflictions. And here's the quote. And I'll send this to all of you in the handout that's related to this session, like I did after the last session. The quote is, as long as the aggregates are conceived, so long thereby does the concept of I exist. Further, when the concept of I exists, there is action, and from it, there is suffering. So those right there, you can see the three thorough afflictions. What we're going to dive into a little bit by talking about karma is why as we misapprehend the aggregates and relate to them incorrectly, which we started in those first three meditation practices we did last week. duly noted on one level. There's multiple layers of doing that kind of meditation. Why does that matter? So to further Nagarjuna's point, as long as the mental, and we're going to talk about those today, the other two aggregates of mental, what we call mental construction and consciousness. Why do those mental and the physical aggregates, which we talked about last time, being misconceived to inherently exist as I, like that's me, that's what I'm about? Why does that misconception result in us taking action in a certain way? And why does that result in suffering? So it's about this, it's about how we're experiencing moment by moment reality, how that becomes part of who we are, if you will. And that's where we're going to talk about karma. So, this mistaken view, again, leads to activities of thoughts, speech, and actions. Those are the three ways we operate. And depending on what kind of thoughts we have and what kind of speech we have and what kind of actions we take, that could lead to suffering experiences. If we're, I'm asking you to entertain and for the moment that if we're misapprehending the way things really are, that could lead to suffering experiences. That's the premise here. So during our lifetime, that's what we do. What do we do moment by moment? We are engaged in activities. They could be activities of body, speech, or mind, right? When you think about it, it doesn't just have to be like physical activities. So what is being proposed in this course is that if we can stop attachment and grasping to mistakenly attaching and grasping to things in a mistaken way, then we could be liberated. We could be liberated from suffering. And that's what the course proposes can be done. And the reason it's important to understand what we're talking about this morning is that this has to become foundational, along with one other topic I'm going to talk about this morning, to doing the kind of meditative practices that we're embarking to do throughout this course. It has to become our motivation further. If we don't see and look at how mistakenly clinging to and having aversion towards things moment by moment can create suffering, which is the Buddha's first noble truth, that life is suffering, well, then you will have no motivation to do this kind of practice. So the idea here is that you might be able to listen to this and with reason and do some meditative practices that bring you to an experiential grasp of, yeah, I could see how this really works, how this can really be something I can use to create a happier moment by moment existence. So that's why we're talking about it. I have in all caps here in my notes, this should be our fundamental motivation, along with one other thing, which I'll spring on you in a few minutes. So, and we have to learn how to do it in an analytical way, because again, we go through our moment by moment lives, at least since we were born in this life. Again, for some people who are like Buddhists, it's been since beginningless time, in a mistaken way, in a non-analytical way. Then we need to develop some practices that will help us in an analytical way, sort of break that pattern. It's not just like listening and going, okay, I got it, I'm going to change. And that's why the three-phase meditative practice is really important, of reflection and then actual meditation. So it's really through our not knowing the actual status of ourselves and phenomena, and through conceiving its opposite, through these attachment and aversions, that we get into trouble. And here's where karma comes in, because as we experience things in a moment by moment reality, for ourselves, we take on, we carry forward, here it is, in our stream of consciousness, these experiences that we have moment by moment of thought, speech, and action. And we develop, this is what karma is, causes that in the future, not instantly, there's no such thing as instant karma, although I like that song by John Lennon, another Beatle. But we develop the causes that lead to the results or effects of those predispositions that are planted in our stream of consciousness. And those results or effects will be what we experience moment by moment. So, the good news is that because these experiences of being attracted to things or attached to things or having aversion to things is really unfounded. When I say unfounded, what do I mean? I mean, it lacks a valid foundation, meaning it's resting on a shaky foundation of misapprehending things, that these things are mine. Like George Harrison said, that's my shirt, that's my car. I'm a beetle, you're not a beetle. I mean, these are the things that get us into trouble potentially if we don't have the right lens to experience those moment by moment arising thoughts, things we might say as a result of those thoughts, and even actions we might take as a result. And that's really what karma is. And these meditation practices of learning about that misapprehension dispel completely that shaky foundation that I'm babbling on about. And again, that needs to become our motivation. Without that motivation, we will not be able to proceed on the path of correcting and in the process transforming our experiences from suffering type of experiences to real and lasting happiness. That's the pitch. That's what might be something that could motivate you. I think it could, if we stop and think about looking for something that we might be able to put into our day-to-day life that can help us have a happier life, because that's what we're talking about here. We could get grand and talk about how that could lead us to nirvana or liberation from, in Buddhism, it's called samsara, a suffering existence. But we don't even have to go there. So just a little bit more about karma, bear with me. So karma, let me find my notes here, is a Sanskrit term that literally means action or doing. And in the Buddhist tradition, karma refers to, this is really, really important, action driven by intention, which leads to future consequences. Because we'll talk a little bit about how karma works in terms of why it's always a future consequence. So these intentions are considered to be the determining factor in the kind of life you have. In a Buddhist context or other Eastern traditions, you might think of it of determining a kind of rebirth you might have. But you don't even have to think that way. You can think about it in the context of determining changes in your patterns of behavior in the way you non-analytically think moment by moment that could have moment by moment in the future a better, more healthy mental states occurring that are arising in your mind and therefore affect your speech and your actions that you take with yourself and with people in your lives to be happier. It's a simple system, not easy to work with, but it's simple. And so how this karma works, we'll talk about one other concept called kleshas, which is also a Sanskrit word. And in Buddhism, these are mental states that cloud the mind and manifest in actions. Actions can be wholesome, unwholesome, or neutral. And kleshas include states of mind such as anxiety, fear, anger, jealousy, desire, depression. the Buddha actually identified 84,000 different mental afflictive states. So, I think that covers most of what any of us might experience moment by moment. And contemporary translators who, the karma is a popular topic, use a variety of English words to translate the term kleshas, such as afflictions, defilements, destructive emotions, disturbing emotions, negative emotions, mind poisons, neurosis. You can go on and on and on. Those are all unwholesome descriptors for kleshas. The kleshas can be unwholesome, they could be wholesome, they could be neutral. Now, where do these kleshas come from? I'm just going to jump back to another image for you real quick. Share screen. Sorry, I'm the Luddite here. Give me a second. Righty. All right. So we're back to our graphic here of the inner circle of the wheel of life. So I talked about the three poisons, and then right around that, the next circle, you see semicircles. If you could see, there's some beings in those semicircles. One's a dark semicircle going downward. The beings are going downward. And then in the lighter color with clouds and like these wonderful looking, monks and lay people, they're moving upward. And the reason each are moving in opposite directions is one half represents actions of body, speech, and mind that people take based on the three poisons that move them to plant seeds, kleshas, in their consciousness that are unwholesome. And then the other half are people doing actions of body, speech, and mind that plant seeds of future activities in their mind stream that are wholesome activities. So it's a really quick, simple picture snapshot for you of where these ripening kleshas in the context of karma, as I described it, being causes that something's planted, kleshas in your mind stream, that then ripen. It takes time for anything to ripen. You plant the seed, klesha is like a seed. It has to be watered and nourished to grow, and it takes time to grow. And listen to this. What is that which nourishes and grows the klesha? It's misapprehending its true nature. Eureka. That's what Harrison was talking about in terms of why it's so important to develop the true nature of reality. And it's also what would cut off the ongoing stream, not cut off your stream of consciousness, but those unwholesome kleshas moving into your mind stream as seeds that then need to be watered and nourished so they can ripen to a full effect sometime in the future. So that right there is what it's all about in terms of why you would attempt to do any kind of practices to become analytically and then experientially aware of how things really work, what the self really is, what the I, me, mine really are in our moment by moment experience. If we can do that, we turn the klesha field of unwholesome activities planted in our mind stream into a major drought. That they cannot grow, they cannot ripen, they atrophy. In Buddhism, there's a phrase that these practices cut those kleshas, those potential karmic ripenings, off at the root. And that's what the process of being able to do these kind of practices potentially brings forth in terms of fruition. And I talk about this now. Let me get off this graphic. I talk about this now in the context of karma, because as we do any of these kind of practices, we are living in what's called a Sanskrit word is samsara, cyclic suffering existence caused by what I've been talking about. And doing these practices, remember what I said about nourishment or watering, feeding kleshas. It's ignorance, it's a lack of wisdom, it's the misapprehension of how things really work that cause them to grow. It's constant. It's going, we're every split second we're functioning as breathing, living human beings. Our stream of consciousness is functioning, and we're taking in through our own perceptions. Our mind's really important here, how we think. But here's the rub. The way karma works in a way that if there's a process of something being planted in my consciousness, and then I need to nourish it before it can come to fruition, what has to happen? There's, in time and space, there's a delay. Remember I said a moment ago, there's no such thing as instant karma. If there was, if I were to, I'm not putting this out in the universe, I'm doing this for the sake of providing hopefully a good, powerful example for your benefit. So I'm not putting this out, my mind is not putting this out, especially since I'm talking about karma. I'm not putting this out there. But let's say I went into my kitchen right now, and on the stove, I saw a cockroach. And I took my shoe and I smashed it and killed that sentient being. And in a Buddhist point of view, all sentient beings have a pure nature. And that would be killing something. So karmically, if I were to kill something, and if instant karma was possible, and I didn't have to nourish that action that I took based on, oh, that cockroach is bad, I'm going to kill it, I would instantly be struck down. It doesn't happen. But I planted that action that I took, planted something in my mind stream that then will have to ripen in the future, especially if I'm feeding it nourishment based on misapprehension. And then the other two poisons of the snake and the rooster, where I'm continuing to have aversion towards cockroaches and misapprehending the cockroaches and wanting to kill them when I see them. So that the real point there is that when we are living right now in this moment, each one of us, we are experiencing every single moment karmic ripenings. Are they karmic ripenings that are happening in my mind stream that I'm creating right at this moment? Or are they ripening of causes that were planted previously by kleshas being fertily planted in my mind stream in time and space previously? That's what I mean by the word previously, that are now ripening now for some reason right now. And from a Buddhist point of view, as well as many other systems of practice that follow karmic laws and principles, the answer is that these are from previously planted causes where I gave it the conditions on and on and on to ripen now. So there's this kind of delay. That's the theme of my ramble here. And it's really important because if you think that doing transformative practices such as these, if you buy into them, or others that develop compassion and other fine qualities, are going to bear instant results, they will. But you've got to characterize what that means, what you're doing actively. And this is the good news. It's a powerful and wonderful thing. You're planting kleshas in your mind stream that are wholesome, that are coming from that semicircle of good activities that we could be doing, the semicircles that I showed you in the last graphic. And they will ripen. And the further good news is they can ripen faster if you're doing certain practices. And one of the most powerful practices is the kind of practices we're talking about doing here, which are those that sort of pull back the veil of how things really work from the point of view of ridding ourselves of misapprehending those ways we normally experience things and replacing it, if you will, with a wisdom imbued knowledge of self, the I, the me, the mine. And not only does that cause the drought that I talked about for unwholesome kleshas, but it's transformative in the sense that at the same time, it puts rocket boosters on our ability to take those wholesome actions we've done and think of it like this: it's like super duper powerful fertilizer, and allows them to grow, karmically speaking, more quickly and to bear positive, wholesome fruit in our day-to-day lives. And that's where we get into why does it matter to understand the true nature of reality that Harrison talks about. Because it leads directly. If you have experiential knowledge of that and apply it to your life, then you will be able to have better, more wholesome mental states. I rattled off a whole bunch of negative mental states earlier: anxiety, depression, etc. Well, there's antidotes to all of those, or should I say the opposite of all those. You can go through the whole list of mental afflictive states, and you could say, well, that, do I want that? Meaning the opposite of anxiety, the opposite of depression, etc. If so, you could actually use those as motivation to try some of these practices, along with some of the practices that actually help you with those mental afflictive states directly, that we learned in last winter's session in the Wheel of Life teaching that I did. So that's the reason to do these practices. That's why they make a difference. So wisdom mind versus misapprehending mind is what we're looking to attain here through these practices. And the wisdom mind, if skillfully applied through practices that are structured and have been done successfully over centuries by yogis, and we're all yogis. If we do any of these practices, I would consider you a yogi, because these are really powerful practices. And I don't mean that in a scary way, meaning they're really empowering. Then you should be proud to be a yogi, that you're even trying to do these kind of practices with that sort of awareness and knowledge. So this is what the three kleshas, the main ones of ignorance, attachment, and aversion, they're called the three poisons. And through understanding the way karma works, this is what we're trying to rid ourselves of, if you will, or become liberated from. And by the way, these don't have to be big, gigantic conceptual boogeyman kind of challenges. Like, I have anxiety and I want to get rid of anxiety. I mean, it's you could apply it to any object that you're experiencing in your life, big, little, small, in between. How do you experience in the Wake Up Now course, the course I did last time on the Wheel of Life? We talked about how you could transform the experience of eating chocolate ice cream. You can apply it to a piece of candy, a slice of pizza, whatever. And that's, I mean that literally. I don't want to go too far into that, because then I'll start teaching that course all over again. So that's sort of reframing why we're doing this. I probably could say a little bit more about, Harrison's motivation again here, but the idea was that I wasn't being flippant in trying to take a pop icon in popular music from a long time ago, former Beatle George Harrison, who happened to have this LSD experience, and then he happened to follow his own guru and his own spiritual path right until his death. Unfortunately, died too young. It's a real solid basis of something to take as our launch point and move forward into this topic. So I think it was really important to reframe it. So what we're looking to do here, meaning Harrison's, the setup I gave us at the beginning of the last class. So the last thing I'll say about Harrison is that he's trying to point us urgently to the fix, which is to wake up, to become awakened to the moment by moment mode of being mindful and aware. And that's all we're going to be experiencing in this rest of this session, is becoming aware, putting at the curb the non-analytical auto response to our moment by moment awakening, understand what's going on karmically moment by moment. But that the good news is it's not fixed. It might be fixed in a sense that right now, what I'm experiencing karmically are my prior predispositions that have been set up from previous causes and conditions and nurturing that I participated in myself through misapprehending and clinging and having aversion to things. But the good news is that can be, by using certain practices, and this should be your motivation, can be transformed. So before we go back to the last two skandhas or aggregates that I want to cover, because we only covered the first three last time, I want to share with you the one other important motivating factor. Because so far, everything I told you about or talked about was really motivating factor of how does this help me? How does this help myself? Well, in this guy who's sitting here today presenting this information to you, in the system that I follow and many, many ancient systems, and why we even have ancient systems, is because somebody cared about somebody else. The Buddha cared about others. Sounds simple, but that's the reason we have his teachings. And we can say that for so many great avatars and saints and spiritual leaders. What does it mean to be a spiritual leader? It's to bring knowledge to others. And I can't continue without saying that in my tradition, and I'm not being an evangelist, I'm just trying to underscore how important it is and how empowering it is, besides knowing how practices like this could benefit you, is that one, in our practices and many other traditions, bring the key element to moment by moment experience of compassion. In my tradition, it's called the two wings of practice. The practices we're talking about in these sessions, which are considered wisdom practices, meaning dispelling misapprehension of self, etc. And then the other wing is compassion. That once you understand what we were just talking about from the wheel with the three poisons and the virtuous and non-virtuous activities, and applying them to our own welfare and benefit to transform our own lives potentially by having our karmic ripenings become of a different quality and our moment by moment experience become of a different quality, then one has to look up and say, at the very least, then, well, if I'm going through this, other people might be going through this, and that should cause one to feel pain and suffering and concern for them. And further, that if you have some knowledge or something you have to offer them, it doesn't have to be teachings. It could be the motivation and intent to do virtuous activities of giving somebody food, giving somebody money, giving them shelter, giving them clothing, giving them love, giving them a hug, anything. If you're doing that with the motivation and intent of benefiting them first, not yourself, then that's compassion. Then that's also, ironically, although it shouldn't be your motivation and intent, improving your own karmic predispositions for the future. because after all, we don't live in a vacuum. We live in in Buddhism, we call it the suffering existence of cyclic life, or it's the suffering cyclic existence, or samsara. We're all in it together. So like each one of you on the screen there is kind of cool. I can see all, I know you probably all can see all of us together too. One nice thing about Zoom is, although I'd rather see you all in a room, it's like we're all together. We're all connected. We're not like we're all connected. And compassion is the connective tissue. So then, as it relates to these kinds of practices, another great Buddhist logician and saint, who was actually someone who underscored and really took to another level the teachings of Nagarjuna, who I mentioned earlier, and I quoted from. His name is Chandrakirti. He identified 3 types of compassion. And each one of those types of compassion have a different edge to it and have a different potential depth of experience to it. So not to get too heady on you, but the 3 are as follows. Compassion, which observes suffering of sentient beings. This is what I was just talking about. And that compassion observing sentient being in its strongest form would be based on the understanding, get this, is what this class is about again, the reasoning behind why migrating beings, us, not just humans, but all sentient beings, why we suffer. And why are we perpetually propelled? And that ties into why I was talking about karma for a few minutes, in that habitual pattern of behavior that goes on and on and on. Again, you can look at it in the sense of like cyclic life of living, aging, sickness, death, rebirth over and over, which is a worldview for some of us. For others, you don't have to do that. You can look at just this lifetime and having those patterns, you can identify those mental afflictive states that are difficult for you and for others you might see. And those so that type of compassion is one that can see that and then is moved. You're moved to want to engage with others to help them through that suffering existence. The other 2 are a little bit more refined in the sense that the second one is called compassion, which observes phenomena. By the way, that's what we're doing. We started to do last class with the first 3 meditative practices, and we'll do at the end of this class with the last 2 of the 5 aggregates. And this one is common to a lot of systems of spiritual pursuit, especially in Buddhism. And when we talk about both non-Buddhist and Buddhist systems, for many of them, I won't go into articulating all of them. I'd be throwing up graphs and charts in front of your face that would make your head spin. They see this sort of compassion that observes phenomena of self and all other phenomena as the end game. That's my phrase. The end game, meaning that this ends suffering forever and ensures liberation. Again, you could think of it from suffering in the sense of in your life, in this one life, because you don't have to be a Buddhist to be listening to this, or liberation, nirvana. A lot of us know that word. But there's a third kind of compassion, which observes, listen to this word, the unapprehensible. And this is the type of meditation practices that in some other forms of spiritual pursuit, including some Buddhist schools, brings us to a state of total, pure, lasting, unending happiness. And if from a Buddhist point of view, it's more than that. And again, again, I keep qualifying this because I know some of the people in this class are not Buddhists, so please don't think I'm evangelizing. But for Buddhists, it's what's called omniscience, a state of Buddhahood. And for people who follow the Buddha, then this is possible. Because after all, for those of you who don't know this, the Buddha was just like us. Okay? You could read the Jataka tales of his life and see that he went through everything that we went through because he was a sentient being, is a sentient being who was in a human condition and other conditions too in the wheel of life, animal condition. There's Jataka tales about him being an animal, etc. So then we're no different. So this is something that I'm delineating these three types of compassions because we're not going to go into talking about these compassions. You can read about compassionate practices in Buddhism in lots of places. I'd recommend reading A Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life by Master Shantideva. He has something in there called the 6 Perfections, and all of them have to do with developing compassionate perfective activities, if you will, the 6 perfections. By the way, the last perfection is the one we're talking about, which is wisdom of how things really work. And in a way, talking about it in this class is we're starting at the end, and as I'm asking you to look backwards. But it is really, really important to understand how the wheel of life construct works, as I described it briefly, how karma works, and to know that if you really want to be successful in practices like this, you need the motivation of what that knowledge brings for yourself, but also for others. Having compassion, they're rocket boosters. And then the ultimate rocket booster for these kind of practices is having wisdom, meaning getting rid of that misapprehending mind and experiencing things clearly. So this was important for me to point out. And what is going to happen as we go through the rest of the meditative practices, we're going to, there's so many meditation practices on this topic, but for this course, we're going to stick with meditative practices on the skandhas, the 5 aggregates. You're going to say, well, John, we've already been through 3. What are we going to do for the next 2 sessions after this? Well, today we'll finish the last 2, mental constructions in consciousness. But this is these 3 that I already gave you and the 2 I'm going to do today. They're approaching that topic of finding the non-self, the selflessness of the aggregates on one level. And what we're going to be going into, I'm going to bring up another graphic. Bear with Cerullo here. Sorry. Where do we go from here? So let's see. You're seeing some of my notes right now. So this is what we're going to be exploring through the rest of the course. It's a specific practice that the great sage that I just mentioned to you, Chandrakirti, gives us for analyzing and meditating on the aggregates of self. It's called the 7-fold reasoning. And as you can see there on my screen, it says, I do not inherently exist because of, and you'll see 7 items listed there. Well, the ones we covered last time, form, feeling, and perception, and then the 2 we'll do today, mental constructions and consciousness, we're only doing them through one set of meditation practices that have to do with this one, not being the aggregates, okay? So we're going to drill down and go further. And using these techniques of the 7-fold reasoning that Chandrakirti gave us, really, really a long time ago. He lived well over 1,000 years ago. So this is these are really tried and true practices by yogis for literally centuries. So no exaggeration when I said that to you. So then I'll send that along to all of you. I took it off the screen so you don't have to worry about writing it down. I apologize. But again, remember, I'm not using one text. I have about 50 books I'm utilizing to do this narrative. And I'm not exaggerating. So a few other things to say before we move on to those last two. Before that, though, because I covered the topic of revisiting the wheel and the three poisons and the non-virtuous and virtuous activities that spawn karma and karmic ripening. And then I talked about compassion. Are there any questions? I should probably just, in case anybody has any questions now, rather than plowing on. So there's one question on the board, on the chat. Maybe I'll answer that and give us a little break here. The question says, does this make the case for avoiding poison intake, meaning what we watch, who we surround ourselves with, etc., in terms of forming unwholesome or wholesome kleshas? Yeah, kleshas, by the way, spelled K-L-E-S K-A-S, I think, something like that. Somebody was asking that in the question, actually. So let me tell you, kleshas, K-L-E-S-H-A-S, kleshas. So yeah, I can send you the spelling of that in Sanskrit and a few other languages too, if you like. But the question is, does this make the case for avoiding poison intake? So I think it's a great question. Then this goes to another part of like what you might want to make part of your spiritual journey. What do I mean by that? In most spiritual traditions, like yoga, for example, yoga has the yamas and niyamas, things to avoid and things to partake in, meaning in the opposite of, and meaning those things not to partake in, the opposite of things not to partake in. And Buddhism has the 10 virtuous deeds. So those things, those topics, and a lot of very, very thorough and very deep practices are contained in lots of scripture, including Christian scripture, and it has to do with ethical and moral behavior. So some of the things that people find, depending on where they are on their own spiritual path, they find that there's a great need for that. There's a great need for that. And in the Buddhist tradition, that's part of what's called one of the 5 paths. And that's the first path of accumulation, where one is collecting virtuous karma, if you will, by not only doing virtuous activity, as in compassionate activity, but also bookend with that moral and ethical behavior. And sometimes people are aided, if they're consciously trying to live a certain way, by avoiding poison. So maybe that means for you not being with certain people. But I have to tell you, that's not a rule. I know people who like spend their life living with gangsters and like, you know, really creepy, horrible people, and they're pure. And I mean that. So that's an extreme. I mean, I'm not saying that we have to be one or the other, but aren't we nuanced? Then we have to be able to know who we are, what benefits us, what benefits others, how much we need in that regard, and then make that part of our practice. But a guiding light for that is trying to find a good solid base of practice that allows you to tap real ethical and moral behavior practices that, again, are tried and true over centuries. And I highly recommend yoga practice of yamas and niyamas, the Buddha's 10 non-virtuous deeds, and there's plenty in Christianity as well. So hopefully that helps. It's not a simple answer, but we have to be more, you know, nuanced, I think, in that regard. And that could be a whole course, by the way. Ron, you have a question.
No, I wanted to make a comment that there is a perspective, a way of looking at it that, of course, you shouldn't be seeking the poisons, but if they come across your path, they're actually your best friends in your development. So don't go looking for them unless you're really strong enough to weather the challenge. But if they come across your path, they're really your best friends in your development.
Yeah, Ron, that's a bravo, Ron. That's a wonderful, succinctly put point. And it goes to the nature of suffering existence in general. You can pan out from Ron's comment and talk about suffering existence. If the Buddha's first noble truth of that life is suffering, then if we understand where that comes from, and we can put it in the perspective of as suffering existence arises moment by moment, and see it as an opportunity, the glass half full, rather than it being as woe is me, but then it's an opportunity to, in Christianity, I was raised a Christian. I've come to think of like suffering existence, the Buddha's first noble truth, as actually being very akin to, it's not the same, but it's akin, conceptually, it's not the same, but akin to the grace of God. When one is able to have something presented to you that seems to be challenging, and I don't understand it, and it even might cause me suffering, and I might even have aversion to it through misapprehending it, then maybe there's an opportunity there, if I can apprehend it correctly, to utilize it in a way that will give me further positive movement forward on the path that I'm on, my spiritual journey towards happiness, and ultimately maybe even towards nirvana. So, it goes, the question that was posed, and then Ron's answer helps to articulate that in essence, when you pan all the way back, that's part of what practices like this are about. So kind of very important. One other question before I move on came in. You speak about karma and previous causes and conditions that develop negative dispositions. I'd say predispositions, by the way. Can DNA, or simply generational sins, be clear, those that come from our families, be part of those conditions and causes? So it's a great question. So some of you who've been in and around this universe that we're talking about today, and specifically karma, and again, karma could be a big, in-depth, 4-part session, 2 hours each, course, and longer, probably in the hands of people more capable than me. But karma is one of my earliest teachers. I remember when I was first taking a course on karma, paused for dramatic effect, and he said, karma is unfathomable. It's incomprehensible. It's not possible for the conceptual mind to grasp all the ways that karma is operating, split second by split second. And it involves all of us, not just us siloed as individuals. So he went on to say some other flowery things. But it goes to your question. The question really is that karma is an individually experienced occurrence, fundamentally from the point of view of what can you do as a place to start. It's also why it's connected to compassion, though, because as we interact with others, we're not only improving our own condition karmically, but we may be helping others in the same way. And it's also why the Buddha taught, it's why Jesus was here, in my opinion, other great masters to share their wisdom. And so if that's possible, then it's also possible for there to be what's called collective karma, meaning karma that's shared generationally, within families, within close friends. And from a Buddhist point of view, karma, the karmic connection with a mother and a father is profound, and it's unique, and it's powerful, and it's special, and it's something that is very deep. And I could do a whole section talking about how one comes to be born from a karmic ripening point of view to specific parents. And it does involve, from a coarse level all the way through to the most subtle level, connection. So DNA, when you talk about DNA, that's a very coarse level connection, but it is very much part of the manifestation of karmic ripening. And it takes two to tango. In the case of parents, it takes three, you and your two parents. So, and there is a connection more to your secondary point about sins, karma being wholesome, unwholesome, or neutral. Then any elements are mixed of those elements, and mostly it's mixed for most of us. We're born human. Then those experiences, those collective karmic experiences, come forward together generationally, from one generation to another, simultaneously within siblings in one generation. Cousins, you can kind of fan out to others in your life, friends that you become close to, etc. So they are part of the causes and conditions that occur karmically. Again, there's a lot more I could say about that, but that encapsulates what we need to know, I think, to answer that question. Okay, so if it's okay, I'll move on to talk about a couple of other things. As usual, I didn't really cover like a third of what I wanted to cover, but we have limited time. I just think it's important to honor my own tradition in terms of, you might recall at the beginning of the first class, I mentioned how what I'm teaching in this course, in these lectures, is not my own thinking. It's based on what I learned over decades of from my teachers and from specific students, other teachers and scholars, so that it's important, it's not something I'm making up. That's very important. With that said, if I do inject something that isn't, that does lean towards the latter, like not making something up, but theorizing something myself, I try to avoid that at all costs. But if I do, then it's my fault. It's not the fault of what I'm teaching you. With that said, I'd like to honor the underpinnings of what we're going to be talking about the rest of this course by quoting. I could give you 100 quotes, but I'm just going to give you a few from the teachers in my lineage that talk about how important it is to tackle what we're tackling. These studies, these reflections, these meditative practices that we're doing in this course. So actually, the founder of the Gelugpa tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, which is a tradition I'm a member of, Jason Kappa, has in his 3 principal aspects of the path, which is a really wonderful book that he wrote. He says the following: if you do not have the wisdom which recognizes the way things are, even if you've cultivated renunciation, from bad things, and even if you have the altruistic mind of enlightenment, by the way, that's code for compassion, you cannot sever the root of cyclic existence, or that pattern behavior that we all have that just comes up every single moment. He says, therefore, make effort in the means of realizing the true nature of reality. Another saint in the Buddhist tradition, Aryadeva, says more directly, quote, when selflessness is seen in objects, which is what we're doing in these meditation practices, the seeds of cyclic existence are destroyed. And this is what I was talking about and why I took time out to talk about how karma works. Because when you are able to see, he's not saying this, I'm saying this, that was the end of the quote, this in the objects, which is why it's worth having the motivation to do these kind of meditation practices, you are cutting off, fertilizing, feeding, watering, nurturing those kleshas that continue the pattern of seeing things incorrectly. So there's more that I could say about that. I've already talked about the 2 wings of practice, which are really essential. And I already mentioned the sevenfold reasoning practice that we're going to really, you guys are going to have a real exposure to a pretty direct and multi-layered set of meditation practices just on the five skandhas that bring us into a set of meditation practices where we're at whatever level you sort of feel comfortable with, among those 7 levels or all of them, you can utilize them hopefully on a level that's comfortable for you. So I'm going to finish today's session by talking about the other 2 skandhas. Now, remember that our goal in those first 3 meditation practices, and hopefully you were able to pick them up from the website page for the course. Gloria was kind enough to put those meditations that I gave you last time there. So I'm going to give you 2 more, and these are tricky. I really debated how to present these. I'm going to ask us to do what we did last time, which is we'll put ourselves into a typical, what's comfortable for each of us, meditative state. And as I did with the first 3 of form, feelings, and perceptions, I did a short analytical walkthrough type of meditation that ended with, therefore, the self, feelings cannot be the self, form cannot be the self, perceptions cannot be the self. These last 2 are more tricky because they're, form is like form, right? It's like this stuff, right? Feelings gets a little more tricky, perceptions get a little more tricky, but mental construction and consciousness get even more tricky. So I'm going to lead us through an extended narrative, which embedded in each one is that analysis of each, but it's also a teaching embedded in each one, which is why it'd be good if you have the recordings too. I think anyway. So as I said, the recordings are being made available, and so you'll have access to them as well. So I think that's what we'll do, and then then we can end there, and then we can see if anybody else has any other questions. Just to refresh our memory, though, from last time, and also for the few people who are here who weren't in the first one, what we got to, and where we're going back to right now, is doing a set of meditative practices where we're using a tradition in meditation on selflessness or not self, which starts at the most primary level, pretty accessible, which is that first reasoning of the 7-point reasoning process of Chandrakirti, that not being the aggregates. The I does not inherently exist because of not being the aggregates. And we take each one at a time. And what we did, this is just refreshing your memory from last time, or if you weren't here last time, we went through form, feelings, and perceptions. And I'm not going to revisit that any further. If you weren't in the last session, there is a document on the website for this course, on the specific page for this course, where you can pick up those 3 meditative practices and you can go through them yourself. And then once the recording's up, you could also listen to them there, and if you prefer to be guided, and do that. So what we're going to do now is go through the last 2. And so I'll ask each one of you, make sure you're muted. You were all pretty good. Nobody was really off mute, but make sure you're on mute. And I'm going to walk us through the other 2 skandhas, or 2 aggregates, with that question that we should have in our mind. And I'll talk about how to keep it in our mind as we go into the guided meditation. So if you would just relax, if you were sitting in a meditative position that you normally might take, it could be in a chair, it could be on a meditation cushion, it could be any position that you're comfortable with. then please do that. Whatever your position, try to relax your body. Start by relaxing your body. Start by becoming aware of your body, head to toe, toe to head, arms, limbs. Relax. Any place you feel some tension, just try to relax. And of course, one can use one's breath to focus on. It helps a lot to relax. And it helps to watch your breath so that you can just focus on your breath going in and going out. With a corner of your mind thinking, let me have this focus on my breath, help me relax my body. And then you could take that same thought, focused on the breath going in and out, and imagine that breath not only moving in and out of your nostrils and into your chest or abdomen, but as you take the breath in, have it permeate your entire body. Very light, subtle, which helps the breath move through the body. Lighter than your normal coarse breath. And further, try to give the quality with your mind to the breath of being light. Light versus darkness. Just light permeating on every in-breath throughout your body. Giving your overall body not only relaxation, as you did previously, but an entire sense of lightness, almost transparent. And as we go through the analytical narrative that I'm going to present, try to keep that in the corner of your mind's consciousness, that your body's light and that you are transparent and blissful, and that everything that you hear coming from me is easily taken in with joy, even if there's not immediate clarity. It's the nature of an analytical narrative. So we will talk about the fourth skanda or aggregate now, which we label. We label mental constructions, which are all mental activities of thinking. Not only that, but patterns of thought. Negative emotions that we may have, such as desire, pride, jealousy, but also healthy emotions such as love, devotion, and patience, especially patience with this topic. In fact, feelings and perceptions, which we previously covered, they too are mental constructions. But for the sake of the 5 aggregate, 5 skanda meditation practice, we will treat mental construction as a separate meditation practice. And further, since today I was using some Sanskrit terms, this particular skanda is what's known as samskara, SAMSKARA. samskara. And samskara also has the meaning of, get this, predisposition, in the sense of tracks left by former deeds that condition one's present thinking and behavior. So now maybe speaking about karma a little bit earlier makes sense why we did that before we took on this particular narrative. And from a Tibetan Buddhist point of view, we really understand that everything that arises in the mind is conditioned by what has gone before. And in general, we can take this skandha, mental constructions, to mean all mental events not included in the other 3 mental skandhas, which are feeling, perception, and consciousness, which we haven't talked about yet. Now, although we do not think of mental constructions or mental events as being self, we do tend to identify our self with what we conceive to be our personality. Maybe even label it with the word ego. So you can bring to mind for yourself an emotion that if some part of our ego or personality might be criticized, for example, we feel we, ourself, have been criticized. However, if one examines the makeup of one's personality very carefully and dispassionately, one finds it even more intangible than the body, meaning, as you might recall the form meditation we did, it cannot be found. At least with the body, one was sure what was included as part of it, even though none of it could be identified as the self. With one's personality, on the other hand, one just has a stream of ever-changing mental constructions and events. One tends to choose certain, more or less constant features of this stream as characteristics of my particular personality. And when they are manifest, one feels a person is being himself or herself, that this is the self. But if one starts to manifest, again, in a more or less constant fashion, totally different characteristics, we talk about him or her having a change of personality. We talk of people not being in their right mind, of people temporarily deranged, and so on. The implication is that there is a person or self other than the present personality or mind state. It is clearly not the personality or any of the mental constructions or events that constitute it. Since none of them exhibit a separate, independent, lasting element that one could call the self. Just like with feelings, perceptions, and form, every arising mental construction arises, has a period of lasting, and then disintegrates. It's impermanent, not independent, not lasting. Therefore, it cannot be called the self. And now, the fifth skandha, or aggregate, consciousness. A consciousness is a moment of awareness. As we think about the four skandhas, or aggregates that we've already meditated on, we might feel that behind all of them, there is a general sense of awareness or knowing. We might even call it the mind itself, as opposed to the mental events that occur within it. We might feel that, hey, this is really what we mean by the I or the self. It seems to be an unchanging, separate, independent awareness that's just going on as the basis of all our other experiences: form, feeling, perceptions, mental constructions. And it is this awareness that is I, the doer. I'm excited. This might be what we're looking for. So think about that. But we're going to examine this idea a little more carefully. I think for most of us, we experience our life going along non-analytically as a sort of stream in time and space. There's a sense of beginning and end, and one event following on from another. Even though one does not think exactly in terms of a moment of experience having edges round it, nevertheless, there's a sense of it ending somewhere. Otherwise, it would just merge into everything else. So our experience and our sense of self is definitely bound by time and space. Therefore, it must be possible to divide it up into smallest conceivable parts and the smallest conceivable moments of time. What one finds is that every moment of experience has two aspects. If it did not have these two aspects, it could hardly be counted as being a moment of experience at all. So, what are those two aspects? There has to be something to experience and something to experience it. In other words, there's always something knowing something or being aware of something. If either of these elements were missing, there would be no experience. These smallest conceivable moments of consciousness arise dependent on their corresponding momentary object of consciousness. And that's what is known as consciousness. It has these two aspects. It's bound by these two aspects. It cannot be experienced beyond these two aspects. So in Sanskrit, the term is vijnana. The vi part of the word means partial or divided. Thus, a consciousness is a partial or divided knowing. This contrasts with the Sanskrit jnana, which means simply knowing. The difference between jnana and vijnana becomes very important in the latter stages of these progressive meditations on the true nature of reality. So the upshot of this rather long narrative on consciousness is that when, in the hope of resolving difficulties on this topic of consciousness and understanding of it, one suggests that the self is that continuing awareness that is behind all one's experience. One must, in fact, be referring to the stream of vijnanas. One may not have analyzed it as deeply as that. Remember, we mostly move through our moment by moment reality our entire life in a non-analytical way. But if one still accepts common sense notions of time and space, then the nature of consciousness must be divisible in the way outlined above. Since each moment of consciousness has a different object, each moment of consciousness is separate and distinct. It might be a consciousness of form, sound, smell, taste, touch, or mental image. But whatever it is quite distinct from any other moment that has arisen before it or is about to arise after it. The moment before has gone, and the moment to come does not yet exist. So, consciousness can only ever be momentary, and such a momentary phenomena would never qualify for the title of self. It is not permanent. It is not lasting. It is not fixed. Thus, the mind of awareness that seems to be behind all our experience cannot be the self either. So, bring your focus and awareness back to your light body and focus on your breath coming in and out, and pull your breath back to from your body, from head to toe to your nostrils, with your breath going in and out, and dissolve your light body into your physical body, more solid form, and bring your focus back to the room and relax As I said, both of those were long narratives. And what I'm going to do, as I did last time, is send you guys these narratives written out. You can read through them yourself. And as we talked about previously in the first class, take that sort of book knowledge, intellectual knowledge of doing that kind of walkthrough, especially the last one, because it takes you a little bit down a rabbit hole of, if you're not used to hearing that narrative, of understanding that even what appears to be this omnipresent consciousness, this fixed consciousness, is nothing more than individual in time and space, arising, existing, and then going out of existence, moments that can't be fixed and therefore can't be the self. That's a lot more subtle than the form meditation, for example. So, you're going to want to spend some time on it. And again, that's why we put these classes like 2 weeks apart. And I encourage you to read through, do the 3-stage practice of reading, learning intellectually, getting comfortable with the topic, and then reflecting further, get more comfortable with it, do the analytical meditation, and then if you can grasp that conclusion, that's what you bring to rest in your mind, and let one little corner of your mind look at that, be comfortable with it, become more comfortable with it and more comfortable with it until you feel that you accept that mode of experience. That's the process, right? So that's it for today. Does anybody have any other questions for me, or want to bring anything up that you feel like talking about? We have 10 more minutes. Ron.
I looked for the Wheel of Life that you did last year. I don't know if I didn't go back enough, but is that also in the YouTube recorded or not?
It is, yeah.
Oh.
The YouTube channel offerings that we have, they're not curated like where you could just find an individual course. There's a bunch of YouTube videos presented by different presenters that just are there, and you have to kind of scroll through, and you'll see, I know because I looked this morning because I wanted to see if last session's was up there. You'll see them. They're there. I saw them this morning, so I know they're there. But if you want, you could always send me an email. I welcome that. And I will send you a link to the specific YouTube sessions. That way you don't have to go hunting for them if you like. And my email address is the letter J, my last name, Cerullo, Cerullo 13 @gmail.com. So if you want, I'll be glad to do that. That make it easier, because if you want to check it out, I want to make it easy for you, because it might be worth it. So.
Okay, great. Thanks. Cerullo 13 @gmail.
Yep.
All right, thanks.
The 13 stands for the day of the month I was born. So.
I thought about your bar mitzvah.
Could be, but no. Okay. So, okay, I got that. Thank you, David. I appreciate that. Just reading a message on chat. So, yeah, if there's no other questions, or no questions at all, we had questions before, so I should say, at least I have some. I love people who send questions. So, I mean, I love everybody, but I like questions, So there is a comment that came through as I was editorializing. We discovering, I'm reading it, so I'm saying, we discovering not self, but what is it that continues when we reach nirvana? It's a fabulous question. Fabulous question. So we'll be getting into that over the next 2 sessions. It's a pretty hot debate in this particular universe of where these teachings come from about what is from the point of view of positing a positive conceptual entity that is a positive conceptual entity that is, as we tackle the topic of not self or selflessness. And the purposes of this particular set of meditations, this first level, of those 7, is focused on not self, or another word you can use is selflessness. And that's what you reside in at the end of the meditation. You don't go to another place where you're going, okay, well then what? And when I say that, I'm going to use a word, not selflessness. You're doing a process of negating what? The positive conceptual label that we put on I, me, my, or self. That's all you're doing. But when I say that, trust that is part of the process, just to get used to pulling yourself away from the positive conceptual imposition or labeling that we put on everything, that I am this, that this is mine, and this is me. And by the way, we haven't even talked about phenomena, like other than ourselves. We're limiting it right now to ourselves. And what is hotly debated among various traditions is, well, then what's there? There are so many different philosophies about self, not self, selflessness, that get into that. And we're going to get into that. And it will be taking us into the realms of understanding what exists in a positive sense, conceptually. Literally, we'll get to that. And what beyond conception continues when we reach nirvana, to use your word. Because the rub of reaching nirvana is that we're here in the realm of conception. That's all every breath I take, every word I utter is conceptualized. And according to traditions of what enlightenment means, what nirvana means, what omniscience means, those are pure experiences of reality that go beyond conception. So walking that tightrope is walkable. So I'm not avoiding your question. I'm just saying that we'll get to it. There are different schools, if you will, and philosophies that posit different takes on that. Even in Buddhism, there are 3 teachings that the Buddha gave, and embedded in those 3 teachings, they're called the 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma. In each one, he taught something different about selflessness. And parsing that is an interesting process in terms of like, okay, well, what should I follow? What should I practice? What should I do? And if he posited different takes on selflessness, is any of it legitimate? Or did he change his tune along the way, kind of a thing? So we will, through the meditative practice that I've chosen for us to focus on over the remaining 2 sessions, and we can go on with this kind of session for endlessly. And I mean that literally because it's so fascinating. But we will focus on Chandrakirti's 7-point practice, because embedded in that is a more direct answer experientially to the question you just asked, and bring us to some understanding about that. So not avoiding it, just saying, yep, that's something that we can talk about, because It gets into something in Buddhism they call Buddha nature. It gets into non-Buddhist practices too, including Christian practices and other Western practices where we have to deal with the concept of the soul. And other practices, what's called subtle consciousness. They're all swimming in the same stream, but to talk about them in the context of selflessness or not self, then we will stay focused on that and get to that a little bit more clearly in the next two sessions. So another comment came through that says, forming wholesome, unwholesome karma. Does this make the case for avoiding? Oh no, I already read that one. What am I talking about? I got one other comment did come in though. On your recommendation, I bought the book Mind Training, which is a big book. Yeah, it is. Is there a meditation in that book that you could recommend that's similar to the meditation we did today? Not really. The meditations that we did last week and today come from the Theravada Hinayana framework of Buddhism, in the sense that it's that type of selfless, not self teaching that is common to all Buddhist and to some non-Buddhist schools, than that the Buddha had in his first turning of the wheel of Dharma. What we're going to move into over the next couple of sessions are more subtle practices, and I'll articulate what that really means at the beginning of the next session, practices that get into selflessness of self and phenomena. And that book that I recommended that you bought has many meditations in it that bark up that tree, meaning the more subtle. There are, and if I gave you a book like from the Theravada school of Buddhism that was about this topic, then they're always framed within the context of other systems, and it gets really hairy. And I could recommend something, but I think it's better to just stay. The idea of these first 5 meditations that we just covered, I mean for them to be something you work on, but I'm going to move you on from them, and I actually want you to let go of them, understand them and experience them, but then move into more subtle meditation practices on the aggregates. And the only reason that book was on that list is because a lot of those meditations are in that book, including Chandrakirti's sevenfold reasoning meditation. You'll find that in there, just so you know. Hopefully that helps you. And I would just stick for today with, for the next 2 weeks, you could check out that book, but as far as the meditations go, just stick with the ones that I put together. One more question. You talk about clinging as being a poison. Is this a toxic state to desire good things for people, especially family members for whom we want good things? That's a great question. So yeah, when we talk about clinging, it's really important that in this frame of reference, we're really talking about clinging to, being attracted to, desiring something through the misapprehension of how yourself and things, we haven't even talked about phenomena yet, but let's say yourself and all other phenomena actually exist. It isn't about clinging. Clinging literally dissolves when one takes on a wisdom mind, if you will, meaning a way of seeing things accurately versus mistakenly. And it isn't about wanting or desiring, I'm using your word, good things for people. It's what is your motivation and intent? Is it with a wisdom mind that wants to benefit them without it being something that you're trying to desire selfishly for yourself, really, the subtext being something like that? And not that you can't have benefit from it, but it always comes back to what's your motivation and intent. And it cannot be, It cannot be pure. It could be mixed. You use the word toxic. It could be unwholesome. It could be mixed. It could even be with good intention. But if it's not through a wisdom mind versus a misapprehending mind, as we've been discussing in these last two sessions, then it's flawed, to say the least, and it will not lead to anything more than some temporary benefit to yourself and others. Because what we're really after here is ending suffering. It is possible. It isn't like some romantic idea or some like, wow, that's cool. It's doable. You have to follow a system that has that as its underpinnings. So nothing wrong with desiring things for other people. It's what, the short version answer is nothing wrong with that. But what is your motivation and intent? And if it is wholesome, then it's not a toxic state. It isn't about clinging then. It becomes something other than clinging. You're transforming clinging. That's when I use that word transforming. And the same thing with aversion, because you can do things for people that you don't feel naturally with a misapprehending mind kindly towards. So, and then that can be transformed too. So hopefully that's helpful. All right, we're over time, but I do want you to indulge me. Let me just read my dedication, as I like to do at the end of any teaching that I do. By the goodness of the deed I have just done, may all sentient beings complete the collection of merit and wisdom, and thus gain the ultimate bodies that wisdom and merit make. May what we've learned here today be wholly dedicated to the future well-being and happiness of all sentient beings, where there is no longer any suffering in existence, and only happiness and endless joy. So with that dedication, I bid you all a good rest of your Sunday. And I can't wait to see you all again. And as I said a couple of times, in person, hopefully next time for some of us, because I think we're getting close to where that's not so hard to do. Let's hope. All right, everybody.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Thank you.
Richard, love
Thank
your
you.
beer, Richard.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay.